Good evening to everyone, and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. I hope that by now most of you have been vaccinated and that all of us are still staying safe and wearing masks and reading 800-page biographies. My name is Kai Bird, and I'm the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York, and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby in particular for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. Please note that our next event will be on June 15th at 6 p.m. when the New York Times reporter Sam Roberts will interrogate me about my new biography of Jimmy Carter. The Outlier, the unfinished presidency of Jimmy Carter, will be released on that date. Please mark your calendars and register for this free event on the Leon Levy website and pass on our website info to your friends. But tonight we are here to celebrate Zachary Karabell's new book, Inside Money, Brown Brothers Harriman and the American Way of Power. Zachary Karabell is the founder of the Progress Network at New America, president of River Twice Capital, and an author and columnist. Educated at Columbia, Oxford, and Harvard, where he received his PhD, Karabell has written widely on history, economics, and international relations. He is the author of 11 previous books, and he sits on the board of New America and PEN America. Karabell is a regular columnist for Time and a contributing editor for Wired and for Politico. Please look for Inside Money at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. Zach and I will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we will take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the question box below to type in your questions, and I will be sure to get to as many as I can. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. And again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our other events. Zachary Karabell, congratulations on this formidable accomplishment.
Well, thank you, Kai.
Thank you. Thank you for being here. Inside Money is really a terrific read. It's both a family biography, as I would characterize it, of the Brown brothers, but also a sweeping history of the role that money has played in our national story from the 18th century forward. But for me, it is also really a story about the American establishment. And, you know, as you know, Zach, I wrote my first book on John McCloy, who hung out a lot in the 1920s and 30s with Brown brothers and Harriman, and knew Averell Harriman and Robert Lovett, and of course the Rockefellers and this whole world. And I've always been fascinated by it. And I think your book sort of, you know, captures the whole culture of money in New York and Wall Street during this period. But it also goes back to the 200 years ago. And anyway, it's I guess for me, I want to first ask you what attracted to you to this story of money and power. Was it that you wanted to write a book sort of like Ron Chernow's book on the Warburgs or Robert Caro's on Robert Moses? Were you looking for a vehicle to write about how power works in America?
So it's a great question. And I think, you know, in part it was a way of looking for a vehicle to write about how money made America and how America then made the world. And Brown Brothers is the longest, oldest independent bank, merchant bank, investment bank in the United States. And that, of course, alone doesn't make it worthy of telling a tale, right? Living old is not in and of itself book worthy. Living well and living interesting is. And so there was a way in which Brown Brothers was, first of all, underappreciated, partly because of their own culture of intense reticence. And even today, I did an event for the Brown Brothers partners right before the book publication, which by their own reckoning, so again, I'm not telling tales out of school here, was a sort of attempt to reassure them that having even a little bit of publicity was not going to be some sort of end of days. And for them, every day they wake up and their name is not in the paper is a good day. So the very fact of this was sort of unsettling. And that was true 220 years ago to some degree. And there was a period in the 19th century, which I write about in the book, where they started receiving a lot more attention just by virtue of size and influence.
Mhm.
So Henry Ward Beecher, who was the great, preacher at Plymouth Church in Brooklyn, the celebrity preacher of his day in the 1840s and 1850s, such that people would actually come from Manhattan, take the ferry across the river just to get to his services, which was a journey in those days. I mean, those of us who live in Manhattan, Brooklyn still feels a little bit like a planes, trains, and automobiles trek across the middle of nowhere. Even so, he used them as a kind of an idée fixe in a negative way, railing against materialism and American culture, of which Brown Brothers was sort of exhibit A. But for me, I joked when I was writing the book that writing about Brown Brothers was a little bit like writing about the corporate version of Zelig, that at every critical juncture in American history, there's a Brown Brothers partner in the second row back left, looking like a banker, wearing black and kind of plain.
Being
And
very,
I was
but being there.
being there, but not being the story, right? They never wanted to be the story. And I was worried that that was going to be a narrative problem, right? People who try not to be a good story are hard to write a good story about. And I hope, I'll judge it, let others judge whether or not the narrative succeeds. But it ended up being a much more dynamic story, interwoven with this idea of, how does money make America and then America make the world? That
Right.
was sort of my
So,
narrative frame.
so give us a thumbnail sketch of the founder, Alexander Brown, whom you say was, quote, destined for a modest life, a destiny he defied, which I found a nice little phrasing. But tell us about Alexander.
So he's born a Presbyterian in the suburbs of Belfast in the later part of the 18th century, and was a linen importer, linen exporter, and a linen merchant in the linen exchange of Belfast, and that was really Ireland's big cash product in those years, and probably would have stayed in that universe had it not been for the eruption of what would then become several hundred years of Irish troubles. First, an attempt to break away from the United Kingdom, and then an internecine conflict between Protestant and Catholic. And he simply gets out of Dodge, or in this case, gets out of Belfast. And because he had a relative who had already gone to Baltimore, he moves to Baltimore and then just sets up shop as a linen merchant in Baltimore, this time largely importing Irish linens and then exporting goods to Liverpool and to the UK, as opposed to the reverse, which had been his thing. And that didn't make him particularly remarkable. There were a lot of Irish immigrants, there were a lot of immigrants, as we know, to the United States in these years. It's the degree to which he then inculcates a family business that becomes long-standing. And he really imprints Brown Brothers in a way that is indelible. The kind of Polonius, Poor Richard-like letters that he writes to his sons, his four sons, over the course of decades, could be dictated by the partners of Brown Brothers today. They really have sort of stayed true to this mantra of rectitude and trust and know your clients, and kind of all these things that we think of as an earlier era of banking. Trust, relationships, knowledge, family, obligations, all of it.
Yeah, it sounds very, very compelling. But one of the larger themes of your portrait of Alexander Brown and his sons is that they were always personally exposed. They could gain immensely or lose painfully from each deal. Now, and this seems to be one of the themes of your book, even at the end. Why do you think it was important that they always had skin in the game? And was this unusual, or was it just part of the 19th century banking ethos?
So one thing I try to bring out in the book, as you say, as a real theme, is this idea of alternate paths and versions of capitalism, as opposed to the one version of capitalism that we tend to think about today, which
Right.
really is a post-70s shareholder capitalism that also became the dominant form of finance capitalism when all these firms like Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs and Lehman Brothers somewhat famously and infamously go public. And by going public, they're able to bet other people's money. And I'm not saying that pejoratively or celebratorily, just factually. The earlier model, which most of these firms were, but Brown Brothers was, the Exhibit A, prima inter pares, was this partnership capitalism where every single deal was grounded in the amount of capital the individual partners of this firm, and largely family partners, but over time, a somewhat more diverse network, are willing to risk and willing to wager. And while that, of course, doesn't preclude greed and ambition and avarice and all the attendant human vices, it literally limits the amount of capital that could be put at risk. And I think in relation to what certain aspects of finance capitalism have become in the awareness of what happened in 2008, 2009, but echoes of which were before and some modest echoes of which are after, it's legitimate to look at an alternate version of capitalism as potentially aspects of which we could reintegrate into the present, with awareness that there's no going back, and nor would we want to. I mean, my line about this, when I've had some pushback about, are you looking nostalgically at an earlier time of partnership capitalism? I think there are things we can glean and learn and integrate in terms of values and culture and balance and boundaries. But going back to a closed WASP elite, where I certainly would not have been invited to have a seat at that particular table,
Right.
is not a world that I have any interest in returning to. That doesn't mean there aren't lessons to glean.
Well, but Brown Brothers Harriman still exists, and it's, as you mentioned, it operates with the same sort of principles and personal banking ethos, and they all have skin in the game, and there are relatively few partners, and it's a relatively small operation compared to Morgan Stanley or Goldman Sachs. In holding up Brown Brothers as a model of something that we can still learn from, an alternative capitalism. I mean, this is a fairly provocative argument in some ways. Are you getting pushback from other economists or investors who are saying, well, this is, as you say, a throwback to the 19th century?
Right. So I think part of the pushback is, one, that very model of what constitutes success, this challenges. So the last chapter of the book is titled "When is Enough Enough?" And the point of it is, in a culture of partnership capitalism where you're limited in terms of size and scope, you're also limited. You're limited in the amount of risk you can take, and you're limited in the amount of reward that you can garner.
Right.
And that is not a motif that is celebrated or vilified in our contemporary world. It's funny, if one's trying to find rhythms of one's own life and past, and you talked about writing the book about McCloy and kind of an interest in power, and you did the biography of Oppenheimer and now Carter. So I once did a very short biography of a very obscure president, Chester Alan Arthur. And the most frequent thing people said to me when I was writing this book was, who? And to some degree, when I told people I was writing about Brown Brothers Harriman, there was an equal, like, who are they? Or, oh, such a shame, what a great firm they once were, or whatever happened to them. So for those who don't know, and there's no reason why most people should know, and nor is it really a focus of the book, it's more of an important coda. They have 5,000 employees. They have about $2 billion in revenue every year, and they have about $500 million in profit pre-pandemic. I don't know that's probably actually more this year rather than less. And if they were publicly traded, based on the comparables to the kind of business they do, which is very workman-like stuff, they do a lot of custodian work, a lot of, holding of foreign assets, they do some wealth management, they probably would be a 10 to $20 billion company in terms of public valuation, which is by no means the hundreds of billions or let alone trillions of dollars of the tech companies. But in the greater scheme of things, a $15 billion company is is a $15 billion company. I mean, by most reckonings, that's an organization of substance and size. And one of the ironies of what happened with Brown Brothers is that in the 1933, because of Glass-Steagall, which the partners at the time more or less support, so they support some regulations so that people have some confidence in the financial world. They choose, unlike some of these others, although like Morgan Stanley, to be a commercial bank, not an investment bank, and they hive off their investment bank. That investment bank doesn't do very well. And eventually it merges with the partners of another investment bank that's not doing very well called Drexel, which had been the offshoot of Morgan Stanley's investment bank. Drexel eventually becomes Drexel Burnham Lambert, which becomes the home for Michael Milken and a lot of the business that Ivan Bosky is doing, and essentially defines the new capitalism of the 1980s, both in this kind of orgiastic, celebratory, Oliver Stone, Wall Street greed is good sense, and in the demonization side of things, where Rudy Giuliani makes his name going after Milken. And that essentially has become the template that we think of when we think of Wall Street. And we don't think of this other aspect of finance, which is more stolid, more workmanlike, and is not headline grabbing, but is A, utterly essential, and B, speaks to a different temperament and mentality. And what I do try to say in the book is, what do you want at the core of your financial system? You know, Brown Brothers, and this is a really important point, probably never could have supported someone like Elon Musk or the internet visionaries. And you probably want a system where somebody's putting up risk capital for those sorts of things. The question is, you don't necessarily want everyone going for that. You don't want everyone going for 100x and doing that. You want some on the periphery, and you want the core to be a more cautious one that respects, a la your Oppenheimer book, that money is like the power contained in an atom, and you better be mindful of releasing it, and that it can go places not so good, even as it can go places that are awfully incredible.
So I can't resist asking you about Leon Levy, the namesake of our biography center, who, as you may know, was a financial wizard on Wall Street and wrote a book in 2003, shortly before he died. And the book, I don't know if you've read it, but the book is a sharply critical attack on speculators on Wall Street in the wake of the 2001 dot-com collapse. And he made some of the same arguments that you're making about the need for regulation, the need for having skin in the game, and not to, chase after money in a highly speculative way. So is he? I mean, this is an argument that is occasionally made in Wall Street.
Yeah, and again, I'm by no means I'm like the progenitor of this partnership versus shareholder capitalism and what changed the incentives on Wall Street. But I think what's the important point about that is it shouldn't be all or nothing, and you do need speculative and risk capital, right? You need someone to build the railroads. Brown Brothers, interestingly, as big as they were in the in the post-Civil War period, largely eschews investing in that wave of transcontinental railroad building, even though they actually were among the first investors in the first railroad in the United States. They underwrite the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad. But they do it not to make money. They do it because Alexander Brown and his sons are deeply concerned, rightly so, that Baltimore is going to be eclipsed by New York City, which had just opened, New York State, which had just opened the Erie Canal, and even by Philadelphia, which had a Susquehanna Canal.
The 1820s or so.
Right, 1828 is when it begins. And they make no money on the B&O Railroad. They don't lose a lot either. And they do it as a public service that requires some capital at risk for a reason greater than the good of the firm, even though the belief was if Baltimore fades, the firm wouldn't do as well. So it was a constant loop, and this is a theme in the book of the public good and the private interest are intimately linked, and you cannot beggar the commons endlessly. So I am not, I think, as adamant as Levy in terms of the sense of bad and good. And one of the themes in the book is this constant oscillation in American culture between kind of liking some speculation and then kind of reacting against it when people get burned. So every 20 years in the 19th century, there's a panic. Usually a speculative orgy precedes it, and then people got really angry at the financiers after it. And the point about the railroads is Brown Brothers is like, look, that's too risky. And in many ways, they were right. As you know, all the people who made the money on the railroads in the late 19th century, including E.H. Harriman, who's the father of Averill and its family fortune, are not the ones who build the railroads. They are largely the ones who buy the bonds that built the railroads after the bonds go bust. After the first wave of investors lose everything, the financiers come in and buy the bonds, the JP Morgans and the Fisks and all this. I mean, the
So Brown Brothers were right not to invest in the first wave.
They were right in that the odds were they would have lost money, but in doing so, they don't make as much money.
No.
And, I think that's a compelling balance when you look at how capitalism now has simply become, for most people, a more maximizer without an understanding of either the public good, the risks, and the need that there's some value in actually navigating through different cycles, including pandemics. Brown Brothers would have been the perfect pandemic firm because they went to bed every night knowing that their books better be balanced because tomorrow everything could go to hell. Be ready for the world to change tomorrow negatively. Right. Don't just be ready for it to change positively.
So talk about the disaster of the Arctic, the shipping, and the lessons that the early Brown Brothers learned from that.
So the one speculative toe dip in the water, Brown Brothers for the 1830s, 40s were the largest cotton merchant in the United States. They controlled between 15 and 20% of all of the cotton trade, mostly not the physical cotton trade, but the underwriting of it and the financing of it through letters of credit, which is rather arcane, but utterly essential. We can get into the whole complicity with slavery, which was a real issue. Although to be fair, part of the reason of the Civil War is the entire economy of the United States is de facto complicit in slavery by 1860 because you couldn't wear a cotton shirt or do business or trade without in some sense benefiting from the cotton economy, and that was both morally untenable and exactly the way it was. So in the early 1850s, late 1840s, James Brown, who's one of the sons of Alexander Brown and himself was like the model of a banker, obviously decides he wants to get out from under the shadow of his family. His brother had become a very powerful politician in the United Kingdom, a member of parliament from Liverpool, and meets up with a man named Edward Knight Collins, who in perfect fashion is also good friends with P.T. Barnum, a little bit before Barnum becomes Barnum. But the point is that, Collins was everything the Browns weren't. He was like roly-poly. He dressed slovenly. He kind of was the guy who looked like every time he showed up, he'd failed to wipe the crumbs off of his shirt. A hustler, the classic kind of American, I got a dream and a plan, I got to get money, what do I got to do? And he wanted to build a shipping line. He wanted to be the first transatlantic steamship baron. And he convinces James Brown to be his business partner. And they come up with a grand idea. Cunard had already started building some, funded almost entirely by the Royal Mail, so with a lot of UK government money. And they make the argument to Congress that in order for the United States to be competitive and not cede the sea lanes, the commercial sea lanes to the British, the US government should support this endeavor, which the US government was uncomfortable doing until the outbreak of the Mexican War. And then suddenly there's this kind of efflorescence of nationalist jingoism, and they get this huge contract. And it may have worked, even though every single crossing lost money, which is why they needed, government money, until the jewel of the Collins line, the SS Arctic, sinks in a freak accident with James Brown's grandchild, daughter, and Edward Collins' wife and child on it as well. And
it wasn't
it was like a Titanic thing,
But they ran into another ship.
They ran into a French trawler in the middle of the Atlantic, the odds of which were slim.
Yeah.
And it was a much smaller ship, so it should have sunk, but instead the Arctic sank. And there was a later book written called Women and Children Last, where the crew basically, because they were for hire, they weren't sort of trained in this ethos of the sea. They just take all the lifeboats themselves. So like 40 of the crew die and 300 passengers. and a lot of the cream of the crop of New York society. So this was a real major tragedy for New York. And it leads Henry Ward Beecher to do another sermon where he kind of does the opposite of a comforting elegy, and instead says this is God's punishment for being too materialistic.
Whoa.
Which is, not the nicest thing to say when everyone's grieving, but very much his MO. And they never again get into a speculative venture. Like that's their last attempt to get into the new, the hip, the cool, because the transatlantic steamship in 1850s was the hip, the cool, the new. It was the railroad, it was the internet, it was the new thing.
So it made them much more conservative.
Yeah.
So let's touch briefly on the slavery issue. I was sort of charmed to learn that sort of the irony of the fact that James Brown was one of the early investors in 1865 of the new weekly journal, The Nation,
Yeah.
where I used to write. So why was this capitalist interested in an abolitionist magazine? And what was the sort of attitude of the Brown brothers towards slavery and the Civil War, and how did they transition this?
And by the way, just to add to this whole interweaving of money and culture, not only did they underwrite a lot of The Nation in 1860, it's a little before 1865, but they then, because they all went to, the next generations all went to Yale in the 19 teens, they underwrite the founding of Time magazine and Henry Luce, who was with Lovett and Harriman, and it was the younger version of them at Yale. And then they decide, as Time magazine's going very well, they'll underwrite Newsweek as well. So, part of their good press during the establishment years is they had somewhat paid for the press that they established. So like a lot of Northern businessmen, they were simultaneously in bed with the cotton trade. And Brown Brothers was even more than that. They, because of outstanding loans to planters after the Panic of 1837, they find themselves as absentee landlords of several plantations in Mississippi, which they cannot unload. Like nobody wants to buy them because they were, because a lot of that economy took years to recover after 1837, while simultaneously being profoundly anti-slavery. They are part of a whole, the movement in the 1840s of being concerned about Texas joining the Union because it would be an extension of slavery. They're against the Mexican War for that reason too. They are founding members of the Republican Party. And so these things exist simultaneously. They both have a moral opposition to slavery and a complete economic complicity and beneficiary of that system. And it's acute in the case of Brown Brothers because they were so central to cotton. But it was also true of a lot of the North at this time in a way that I think is one of the underappreciated reasons for the pressure leading up to the Civil War. It wasn't just the link and how long can you remain half slave, half free. It was how long could the free part of the country remain deeply embedded in a slave system that they essentially were benefiting from, fueling, assisting, allowing. And I think that's one of the reasons why all this comes to a head as well. And the Brown Brothers story is a very small part of that much bigger story.
But as you say, they're always there in the back of the room, witness to history and playing as an actor in history. So you also write, quote, that the combination of substantial wealth and low profile became one of the defining features of the American WASP elite. This notion seems almost quaint today if we look around at some of our current billionaires. So why was that important and to the formation of the, quote, establishment? And should we mourn the passing of the establishment? I mean, it doesn't really exist anymore, does it?
No, and this gets into a whole other set of territories, which you're quite familiar with, which is the kind of the post-60s reaction against that establishment and that elite. And, there was a lot written about that. There's Christopher Lash's The Death of the Elites and the whole sort of sharp contrast. And in many ways, their class construction, because you don't really have this coalescing until the 1890s into the 1900s. And it takes a bunch of private schools, and it takes places like Groton and St. George's, and then it takes the Ivies, which were much more about creating a cohesive class than it was about an education in particular.
Right.
And they were really inculcated with this idea of with great power comes great responsibility. They bought into the Spider-Man thesis of history.
Right.
And then Groton, has its Latin "to reign is to serve" motto,
Right.
which was drilled into generations of Roosevelts and Brown partners by Endicott Peabody. And then Yale had its own noblesse oblige version of the same. And by the 1970s, all that is treated as just complete self-serving malarkey. I haven't used the word malarkey in a while as well, so that's a great advantage of this conversation. And they, I think it is wrong to be too hypocritical about that. I've said a number of times, and I will keep saying it. They were simultaneously able to be self-serving and of service. That there is not human beings can exist on both planes. That the world they create after World War II is simultaneously a world of rules and institutions that will benefit them greatly in terms of status and money and power, but also have some great benefit to a global order and to a national economy. And I do think they really believed this, that Harriman and E.H. Harriman had this idea of the only point of making money is to give something back. And they had sort of drunk at the well of Carnegie's gospel of wealth, that you cannot, as I've said, beggar the commons endlessly without it coming back to bite you. And they remembered, someone who seemed less civic minded, someone like J.P. Morgan, who was a fascinating character, but very much clear about his role as a private citizen, staying a private citizen, who is lionized as the hero bailing out the banking system in 1907. And then less than 6 years later, when he's called in front of the Peugeot committee by Arsène Peugeot about the money trust right before he dies, is totally vilified as the evil genius. And I think, this elite learned from that, that if you don't give back, it will bite you. There will be a backlash. They don't say it, that's not as much a part of their patois, but I think they kind of knew it.
So it's not all malarkey, this establishment
Right.
ethos.
Now,
They
on the
really
question
did
of,
believe in it. They wanted to have public service.
right,
And I think one of your characters, that you most vividly write about is Averell Harriman, who is very much a product of this whole culture and Skull and Bones. And so let's talk about Skull and Bones a little bit and Averell Harriman's trajectory. He's sort of been forgotten, but he was a really important figure in Wall Street, but in World War II and throughout the 50s and 60s and 70s. He was a key figure who was trying to do the right thing, but
such that, the New Yorker runs a profile of him in the late 40s where they call him the plenipotentiary, that he had become the sort of presidential, minister without title everywhere to everybody about everything. And, it's a role that's not, to some degree, Jimmy Carter plays this a little bit as his post-presidency, but is in a much more independent fashion. And I think, Harriman is fascinating because he does epitomize this. He is to the manor born. He inherits what is essentially a multi-billion-dollar fortune from his father, E.H. Harriman, who is also less remembered than some of the other railroad barons, but was absolutely central to the whole, the Northern Trust case, securities case, which is the first and one of the only really big breakups of a trust, certainly under Roosevelt, who TR earned a reputation for trust busting, but really only busted one trust. And Averell, was clearly ambitious, very hard to read. Like, this is a man who did not leave a lot of himself in the written record. It's unclear what the inner life was relative to the outer life. I always wonder if you could really get someone on the couch. Are there people at times who, if it were a New Yorker cartoon, the bubble coming out of their head would be blank? And yeah, I don't know about Averell. There was a long book written, one biography of him was written about 20 years ago, and it's a very good biography of the life he led. It doesn't get you too much to the man he was, and but he was everywhere. He serves Roosevelt. He becomes a minister to intermediary with Churchill in Russia, then ambassador to Moscow, then kind of the person who helps Kennan commission the long telegram. Then he becomes Secretary of Commerce. Then he becomes the administrator of the Marshall Plan aid in Europe. Then he becomes the administrator of all US economic relationships with all of Europe for a few years. Then he becomes governor of New York. Then he becomes undersecretary of state for East Asian affairs and helps, lead to the whole Vietnam morass as part of that group of wise men. And he was ambitious and driven by his ambition, unequivocally. But he also really believed that somehow this was his responsibility. And I don't quite know how to get around the ways in which talking about this can sound nostalgic, when what I'm actually trying to say is that impulse to add your voice, energies, efforts, personal capital, whatever, to the public good and to help shape it is, I think, what's incumbent upon all of us in a democracy, especially those with means. And that lesson can apply much more broadly and is weirdly much less present in what is presumably a much more meritocratic elite today, who seem much less concerned by what are their obligations to the public good. So I think we can criticize the exclusivity and the particularities of the vision that these men, and they were all men, constructed, while simultaneously respecting that a healthier society is one in which multiple voices see their imperative to shape the commons.
I think that's a very good summary. I quite agree. I mean, there are many things I admired about Harriman, and my biography of McCloy. He was a very down-to-earth, commonsensical character, and he had this same ethos of serving the Rockefellers but trying to serve the public good. And I criticized him harshly for some of his mistakes, like at the end of his career, sort of mixing up the public good with the good of Chase Manhattan Bank in the midst of the Iran Revolution and the hostage crisis. It was just an outrageous sort of mistake. But this leads us to, this is one of the things that's very intriguing about your book. It raises this whole issue of what is the role of an elite in a democracy, and particularly with an elite, with a moneyed elite. And so who are the Harrimans of today who are moneyed but looking out for the public good? Are there any?
Yeah, and I think that's very hard to find. And I do think there's a big difference between, moneyed elites or tech elites today setting up massive private foundations and philanthropies, which Carnegie totally would have approved of, right? In his Gospel of Wealth, if you give it away in your lifetime, kind of the giving pledge that Gates and Buffett helped spearhead a bunch of years ago. But I think there's a difference between that and the public good, right? Because if you set up a huge private foundation, which is admittedly better than not setting up a huge private foundation, net,
right?
It's still controlled by you or by your trust, whoever you appoint to control it. There's no public discussion there, right? There's no, what was that?
You're thinking of Bill Gates?
Or any of these, even, Mackenzie Bezos, who's doing a wonderful job giving away billions of dollars. But it's because she's sitting there saying, I want to give this away. And again, is that better than not giving it away? Absolutely. But there's a difference between that and, look, the only forum we have for public discussions in a democracy is government. And it's flawed and it's dysfunctional and it's, potentially over-focused on in many ways. And even if you're not going to serve in government the way these elites sort of thought was a natural outgrowth, which they didn't think in the 19th century, by the way. That's really a 20th century evolution in the United States. They did feel like they had a responsibility to be in the muck of public debates about who we are. And yes, they retreat in the 70s and they're assailed and they're treated, they become Exhibit A, and Brown Brothers is the source of a lot of conspiracy theories. And when George H.W. Bush becomes president, there's a lot of, how did they make their money and were they in bed with the wrong people? And, so they were seen as this kind of,
but the Bush father, Prescott, was from Brown Harriman at one point.
Right. And that's where the Bush money comes from, as well as some money from the Harriman side, because he married the daughter of George Herbert Walker, who had been one of Harriman's, the presidents of his estate and company. So I don't see it today. And it's less like, oh, they should serve in government than it is, oh, you don't get to unilaterally try to write the rules and then unilaterally dispose and solve the problems you think should be solved. I mean, obviously you do get to do that, evidently. I'm just suggesting I don't think that's a healthy equation going forward. It may be a tenable one if you've got $100 billion, but it doesn't mean it's the right one for society. And part of what I try to make the point in the book is, regulation alone is not going to change the cultural mindset. You're not going to regulate a class of privileged people into a responsibility to the commons.
Oh, right. It's got to be a culture,
right,
that comes from the schooling,
and some companies are beginning to do this, right? I don't think it's like there's total crickets here, and they do it quietly, and they do it, I think, with some integrity, because they realize it matters to their employees, it matters to their social license to operate. So I don't think it's all, a cynical beggar thy neighbor, get what I can while I can get it attitude. But I do think on tech land, there's way too much of that because of a scorn for government and essentially an unwillingness to engage in the contestation of shaping the commons the way democracy, whether it's through government or just through multiple voices coming into contact, demands. Yeah, I think the elite of these eras were, weirdly enough, more democratic, small d democratic, than a lot of our elites today, because they understood their connection to the larger society.
Well, that's a rather severe indictment of our current elite, then, if they don't understand that we all rise or fall together, and that the public commons, as you say, needs to be invested in. That's very short-sighted. Yes. So let me ask you, you mentioned earlier in this conversation that you had just had a meeting with a book event with Brown Brothers. What kind of reaction did you get from them and what kind of questions did they throw at you about the book?
I mean, it's funny. I don't want to be careful about what I talk about because it was a sort of a private thing.
Okay.
But I think it's, so I'm going to use an odd analogy for today. There are people who I'm in New York City, and there are people I know who walk out now in a kind of a pseudo post-pandemic moment, and what they see is that store's out of business. There's more homeless people. There's a rise in some degree of, violence here and there that is more known in the news and experienced personally. And that's their visceral experience. And I walk outside and I'm like, wow, there's so many people out, and there's restaurants are full outside, and people are enjoying the spring, and the city's coming back to life. And those are both legitimate experiences, albeit different experiences. And I feel like the Brown Brothers partners were a little bit concerned about, is everybody going to pay attention to like slavery and class exclusivity and not, the bigger picture of all these things that I've talked about. So that, their concern was they were much more attuned to the potential negatives than attuned to the potential positives.
All right. So perhaps we should turn to some questions now in our chat box. Please do, it's not too late to add a question here or there. Here's a question from Cathy Lazier. Could you address Prescott Bush's role at Brown Brothers and their financial support for the rise of Nazi Germany, which would have violated the later Trading with the Enemy Act, discovered by The Guardian and other researchers in the National Archives?
Yeah, I mean, I happen to just, the short answer is it's a totally fair question. It's been out there, and I think it's incorrect. Prescott Bush and Brown Brothers definitely had dealings with a series of German companies in the 1920s into the 1930s, including ThyssenKrupp and some others, who then became part of the industrial architecture of the Nazi state and of the criminalities of the Nazi state, including the Holocaust. It's similar to what I was talking about with slavery before, which is it would have been difficult to have any business dealings with Germany in the early 1930s and not have some complicity in companies that themselves became part of the industrial architecture of the Nazi state. So did Brown Brothers have those relationships? Absolutely. Did Brown Brothers purposely facilitate relationships that by the late 1930s and into World War II were then explicitly and purposely complicit in atrocities? Absolutely not. And whether or not there were aspects of what they were doing by the late 1930s, before 1939, that could potentially have skirted a later law to prevent some of those interactions is, I think, an open question. But most of it is a pre hoc violation of a post hoc legislation, meaning you cannot be held liable for something that at the time wasn't illegal because it then becomes so. I'm not even entirely clear whether or not I agree with the claim that what they were doing at the time would have violated it, because Nazi Germany wasn't an enemy until post 1940 for the United States. I mean, we were still neutral when Germany invades and war breaks out in 1939. So what you have is a series of subsequently very uncomfortable business relationships based on how these things evolved,
Right.
which I do think is different than purposeful complicity in the rise of Nazi Germany.
So here's a question from Shelby White. Is the government better able to spend money, I guess, investment money, social money, than the private foundations?
Absolutely not. No question about it. The government is not even close to able to spend money with the efficacy and focus and alacrity and oversight that a private foundation does. And in many ways, that's not the point of what I'm saying, which is government is the only place where multiple voices can come into contact to shape collective outcomes that are also the product of collective income, i.e. our tax dollars. And there are some things that only a collective and only a government does. None of us build interstate roads.
Right.
None of us will collectively fund pre-K and education universally. I mean, some of us will locally. And no entity could have floated the damage of the pandemic than a government. Now, that is not an argument for the fact that it does it often badly, clunkily, corruptly, you name it. But I don't think that's a reason not to try to shape it. I think that's a reason to try to shape it.
Okay. Here's another question. Businesses aren't always the best at preserving their own history. Could you describe your research and the sources for this book? Yeah.
So this was one advantage of the historical record of this book, which is that Brown Brothers Harriman commissions a 150th anniversary corporate history to coincide with their 150th anniversary in 1968. And frankly, in my telling of the firm's history, it really begins with Alexander Brown in 1800. But there's an entity that they consider to be Brown Brothers that, for reasons that actually don't make a lot of sense, they date for 1818, which was the opening of an office in Philadelphia. And there were a whole series of other Brown Brothers over time. There's Alex Brown and Sons that ends up being hives off from the main firm in Baltimore, and there's Brown Shipley in the UK, which also becomes very important to British financial history, as well as the source of two of the governors of the Bank of England, including Montague Norman at the time of the Great Depression. But this gentleman they hire spends 5 years writing the history and essentially assembling all of the documentary record, including the family's personal and private letters. And then all of it is deposited at the New York Historical Society in the mid 70s, mostly unexpurgated, much of which, if there were letters and documents that were deeply embarrassing that showed that, like, Brown Brothers grandchildren secretly ran brothels in New York in the 1880s, those were not only effectively destroyed, but effectively erased from history. So barring the possibility that everything was very carefully manicured over time, although not the slavery stuff and, not an occasional cultural bit of anti-Semitism just kind of thrown in, most of the record appears to be intact and in that 150 boxes of stuff at the New York Historical Society. So I didn't really need the cooperation of the firm in any meaningful way. I mean, I wanted some feedback and I wanted some insight. I wanted to think about how they thought about the firm. But I didn't need access, and I didn't need to, promise anything for that access. And frankly, it's hard to find a corporate archive that deep and that intact and that close to where I live, just in terms of ease of research.
This causes me to ask, what was sort of the greatest surprise you found in those archives?
I think the greatest surprise that I found was how few surprises I found.
Oh.
I mean, you're always expecting like, oh my God, I had no idea. And, frankly, that imbues some of the book. I mean, I was just not, there was not like a black sheep there. There wasn't wow, I had no idea they were, hanging out with Pulitzer developing gunpowder because they really wanted to blow up parts of the US. Something that would have been just juicily salacious. Even things that I kind of knew about. So Brown Brothers in 1911 through 1913 is almost unilaterally, along with J.W. Seligman, responsible for the US occupation of Nicaragua, because they had bought up some bonds. Again, they didn't invest directly. They bought up the bonds of other people who had wanted to get out. So they bought up the bond cheaply, pennies against par. And then when it seemed like the Nicaraguan government wasn't going to be able to protect their commercial interests in the country, they call upon Taft, and Taft sends a Marine contingent headed by a colorful character named Smedley Butler, and they occupy Nicaragua. And that begins basically a few decades of US intervention and occupation of Nicaragua. And Brown Brothers takes over the central bank. James Brown, the grandson of that other James Brown, it actually has his name signed on the Nicaraguan Cordoba, which was their currency. It's his name, like James Brown, like he's the secretary of the Nicaraguan Treasury. And you'd think they would have tried to, I don't know, like cover up that story. Like it's a pretty naked act of imperialism. Granted, they felt like they made the country better. Nicaragua's credit improved, the material conditions, they invested in the railway. I mean, they could paint kind of a rosy picture. But even that, I mean, the record of that within this archive is unexpurgated. Again, largely because I think they thought they were doing a good thing, and maybe they were doing a good thing, but they didn't feel they had anything to cover up. And the same thing about the debates around slavery. There's no attempt to like gild the lily. So I was frankly surprised that I wasn't more surprised.
Okay. So how about people like today, Michael Bloomberg or Jeff Bezos? Are they, Bezos has invested 200 million or more in the Washington Post. He probably makes an argument that he's looking after the public good. And certainly Michael Bloomberg is, he tried to run for president. He ran and was mayor for many years. And,
look, I think Bloomberg, probably is a good iteration of, for whatever his own personal ambitions when he was mayor of New York, he actually cared about the city and wanted to make it a better place, and worked to do so, in the trenches of local retail politics, even though he sort of remade some of those politics. I think that's different than Bezos buying the Washington Post. I mean, kind of back to our question, are private foundations better than public foundations? Better than no foundations? Absolutely. Is it better that a bunch of billionaires have bought up every single insolvent media outlet, from Time Magazine to the Los Angeles Times to the Washington Post to the Boston Globe to the Wall Street Journal? Yeah, it's a lot better, because for them it's a rounding error and they spend money that ad-based news is not going to spend. I mean, even The Nation, for a while benefited from Paul Newman's money and other, people who basically just did it because they cared. Harper with the MacArthur money. So that's better than not. But I don't think it's equivalent to what I'm talking about in terms of really getting in the muck. And Bloomberg is more of that.
Right. So can you talk about how Brown Brothers Harriman survived the 2008 debacle?
Just fine. You know, they had no exposure. They weren't trading mortgage-backed securities. They had no leverage. They were most of their income was transactional. Again, their wealth management business, insofar as it depends on the value of stocks and bonds, certainly took a hit in 2008, 2009. Some of their transactional business took a hit because the system sort of froze up for a bunch of months. But they also had very little exposure, meaning this was a business that was managed so carefully and conservatively that during a crisis, as Alexander Brown had talked about during the War of 1812, you know, when you see the storm winds coming, pull back, don't make hasty decisions. Now is not the time to buy or to sell. What read as sort of homilies, but which are eternally and continually forgotten. Plus the firm's own history in 1837 with a little more of a come to, you know, a near-death experience in their own exposure. They are ready for something to go wrong. And so when something does go wrong, even systemically, they are well positioned to be less burdened by it than a lot of their peers, and also less disposed to take advantage of it. You know, they're not the firm that swoops in a year later and buys up all the stuff at distress levels.
So that's both their strength and their weakness.
Correct. Their virtue and their vice.
There are about 30 partners in Brown Brothers today.
Yeah, around that.
And are these, they're probably mostly men still?
Mm-hmm.
And are they still products of Groton and Yale and Harvard?
The backgrounds have diversified somewhat, but I'm not sure you would say that it would, in terms of how we are currently using the word diversity would not be the watchword for the composition of the firm or its partnership. Nor would it be for many law firms, nor would it be for many private equity firms. I mean, you know, and particularly privately held companies have less pressure to do so than publicly held companies today, or educational institutions, which are, you know, more front and center, or nonprofits, which really kind of need to answer that constituency.
Right. So what about how many of them are skull and bones, or is that classified?
Oh, I think very few now.
Very few now.
Okay. Yeah. And I couldn't tell you even if they were.
Right.
No, that's not true. I mean, it's skull and bones membership is not hyper secret.
It's not a state secret.
It is not a state secret. No, there is a roster somewhere.
Yeah. So Zach, this has been a lot of fun, and it's a terrific book. I found it really easy to read. It's about money and business and political economy, but you're a storyteller, and it's, you know, it's a fabulous story.
Thank you.
Using this vehicle of a private banking family to tell American history, it fills a gap in our history, and I commend you for having done it and added to our literature of political economy. But it's a very readable book too, and I encourage everyone to go out and get it at your local bookstore, and preferably your independent bookstore.
And Father's Day is coming up. Buy a bunch for all of your fathers. Buy ones for your kids when they become fathers. Just buy a lot.
So
buy more than one.
I just want to ask, are you working on something else?
I am working on a history of how the human race solved for the problem of scarcity in the 19th and 20th century, like why the Malthusian trap and the population bomb never happened. And I'm writing a global history of corn as a way of answering that question.
Wow, that sounds terribly ambitious.
So there you go.
Well, once again, thank you very much for participating in this conversation and educating us. And I encourage everyone to go out and buy the book.
Thank you, Kai. Thank you, everyone, for coming tonight.
Yes. See you all. Good night.
Good night.